They say the Ozark hills never forget what's buried in them. In the spring of 1901, a small homestead outside Marion County began whispering its secrets through the cracks of its barn. At night, when the wind crawled down from the holler, neighbors swore they could hear a boy sobbing behind the slats, low, rhythmic, and human. The family told folks it was just a HAINT, a restless spirit that wandered the fields. But here's the part no one dared to ask aloud. Why did that HAINT call out the father's name? The cries from that barn weren't echoes of the dead, they were the sounds of something the living refused to claim. For 3 long seasons, the family fed and hid what they swore was a spirit, but its voice carried a name only blood could give. When the truth finally surfaced, the whole town learned that some hauntings aren't born from death, but from denial. You've just stepped into the shadows of shadow stories, where the bravest souls dig through the dust of history to uncover what should have stayed buried. Do you have the courage to hear what really lived in that barn? Subscribe now, and tell me where you're watching from, so you can join this investigation into the Ozarks' darkest secret. The year was 1901, and the Ozarks were a place suspended between wilderness and faith, where superstition filled the spaces that science had yet to reach. The hills rolled like sleeping giants, cloaked in mist and silence, dotted with clapboard. Homes built by hands that knew more of the soil than the scriptures. Folks here didn't trust strangers, nor did they trust the law. They trusted what they could see and what they could feel in their bones when night fell quiet. Now, I want you to picture this. A dirt path winding through cedar and hickory, leading to a weather-beaten farmhouse leaning against the wind. Chickens scratching at dry earth, a rusted plow half buried near the fence, and beyond that, a barn standing too far from the house, as if the family itself wanted distance from whatever lingered inside. Life in the Ozarks was hard. The men worked the limestone quarries, the women kept house and prayed against storms, and every family carried a story they didn't tell at church. But the Millers, the family at the center of this tale, carried one darker than most. They'd lost their firstborn years earlier, or so folks thought. A fever, they said. Buried quick, no preacher present. Yet by that next spring, the neighbors started whispering. Because late at night, from that lonely barn on the hill, they could hear a child's voice, calling softly for its mother. To the townsfolk of Marion County, Thomas and Eliza Miller were the picture of frontier decency. He, a stoic farmer with calloused hands and an iron sense of faith. She, a quiet woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes. They sat front pew every Sunday, donated what little they had to the church roof fund, and kept to themselves. But behind those gentle manners and clean Sunday clothes hid something colder, a silence that felt rehearsed. Now, you have to understand, in the Ozarks, a man's reputation was worth more than his land. Thomas Miller had clawed his way out of poverty, earned respect, and built a home with his own sweat. Nothing would ruin that. Not gossip, not pity, and certainly not the truth. So when his firstborn son fell ill that winter and the doctor never came, Thomas made a choice that would rot his soul from the inside out. Neighbors said Eliza stopped singing after that. She'd once been known for humming hymns while hanging laundry, but that spring her songs turned to whispers, then to silence. When asked about the boy, Thomas simply said, "The Lord took him early." And that was that. Except it wasn't. Because months later, when the family's lanterns still burned past midnight, Thomas was seen hauling food out to the barn instead of the chicken coop. The whispers began. Folks started asking what exactly was the Lord keeping in the Miller barn. Thomas Miller was no fool. He knew that in a town that thrived on gossip, truth was the most dangerous thing a man could own. So when neighbors began to wonder why his lantern still flickered past midnight, he gave them a story so ordinary, so small, it slipped right past suspicion. He told them he was tending to a calf born weak and blind, needing warmth through the cold nights. And in the Ozarks, where livestock meant survival, no one questioned a man losing sleep for an animal. Now, I want you to picture this. Thomas in his long coat, stepping out into the fog with a pail of milk, the faint glow of his lantern painting gold over the grass. From the porch, Eliza watched in silence, her hands wringing the same piece of cloth until dawn. The barn door would creak open, then close, and she'd whisper a prayer no one ever heard. When neighbors asked about the calf, Thomas would nod, spit into the dirt, and mutter, "Weak thing, might not make it." It was a simple lie, but it worked. It explained the end, sounds, the movements, the late-night visits. And yet, there was something odd. No one ever saw that calf. Not once. Not even when the family traded eggs and milk at the general store. People stopped asking after a while because in the hills you learn quick not to look too hard into another man's sorrow. But some secrets don't stay fed in the dark forever. By midsummer of 1901, the Miller barn had taken on a life of its own. Folks said it hummed at night, a deep, throaty vibration that rolled down the valley like thunder trapped beneath wood. Sometimes a flicker of light escaped, the cracks, like a lantern swaying too high, too wild. Children dared each other to sneak close, but none made it past the fence, because standing near that barn, you could feel something watching you from the dark, something that breathed slow and shallow, like a sick child trying not to cry. Now, let's be honest. The Ozarks have always had their stories. HAINTs, witches, holler ghosts. People blamed the strange sounds on spirits, or on the wind moaning through the cracks. But those who lived closest to the Millers noticed more than wind. They saw Eliza creeping out at dawn with bundles of cloth. They heard soft lullabies drifting from the barn long after midnight. And once, a neighbor boy swore he saw a hand, small, pale, trembling, reach through the slats. Thomas began to change too. His sermons grew harsher, his temper sharper. He built a cross over the barn door and said it was to keep the HAINT inside. But crosses are meant to guard against evil, not imprison it. So, the question everyone whispered was never what lived in that barn. It was who. When the talk grew too loud, when even the preacher's wife whispered that something unholy was stirring on the Miller land, Thomas did what every proud man in a small town does. He took control of the story. He started calling the noises the HAINT, a restless ghost bound to the property after an ancestor's sin. And in a place where everyone believed in curses more than doctors, it worked like scripture. He even went further. Invited the preacher to bless the barn one Sunday after service, right there in front of the congregation. The old reverend sprinkled holy water on the warped boards, recited Psalm 91, and declared the spirit contained. Thomas bowed his head, his hand trembling, just enough to look devout. The crowd left feeling righteous and satisfied, because the Ozarks run on two things: faith and denial. Now, I want you to picture that moment. The townsfolk scattering, the preacher's wagon rolling away, and Thomas standing alone before the barn door. The cross, above it, dripped water like it was weeping. Behind those boards, something shifted softly, slowly, as if listening. For weeks after, he told anyone who asked that the HAINT had gone quiet. That prayer had worked. And when folks nodded and said, "The Lord is merciful," he smiled, that hollow smile only guilty men wear. But mercy had nothing to do with what was happening in that barn. Not anymore. Every secret needs a keeper, someone who knows just enough to stay silent. For the Millers, that person was Jonas Pike, Thomas's hired hand, a drifter from Arkansas with a crooked jaw, a past he never spoke of. He'd worked for the family since the winter before the boy's death, patching fences, tending livestock, and drinking from a flask he thought no one saw. Jonas was the kind of man who'd do anything for steady pay and a hot meal, even if that meant looking the other way. Now, you have to understand, Jonas wasn't blind. He heard the sounds, the sobbing that turned to coughing, the whispers that didn't belong to ghosts. Once, he caught Eliza outside the barn, pressing her hand to the wood like she was soothing a child through it. Her face streaked with tears, her lips trembling with words she couldn't say. Jonas almost asked, "Almost," but Thomas appeared behind him, hand resting on the rifle slung over his shoulder, and said quietly, "You're paid to fix fences, not spread stories." After that, Jonas stopped asking questions. He started drinking more. When neighbors teased him about the HAINT, he laughed too hard, too long, the kind of laugh that hides fear. But secrets rot the people who keep them. By harvest season, Jonas had begun hearing the voice in his sleep, a weak, pleading murmur calling his name. And one night, just before the frost came, he stumbled out of bed, grabbed a lantern, and walked straight toward the barn, as if answering a call that wasn't meant for him. The Ozarks have always been built on quiet suffering, the kind that doesn't make it into ledgers or sermons. And that's exactly what the Millers were. A family of victims long before the HAINT ever started to cry. Eliza Miller, frail and sunken-eyed, lived like a ghost within her own walls. She bore the weight of her husband's pride and the sin they buried together. Every dawn, she stood at the window facing the barn, her fingers clutching her rosary, until the beads cut into her skin. She prayed for forgiveness, but deep down she knew God had stopped listening the night they locked that door. Their younger children, Clara and Ben, were victims too, though they didn't yet understand of what. Clara, just 9, thought the whispers in the dark were angels. She left biscuits by the barn door, whispering lullabies to the HAINT that wept inside. Ben, only 6, followed his father's orders: never speak of the noises, never look inside. But innocence doesn't protect against nightmares, and soon both children began waking in tears, claiming they'd heard someone calling their names in the wind. Now, I want you to picture this. A family gathered for supper in silence. The lantern's glow caught on Eliza's trembling hands. The father's jaw locked tight, and beneath it all, faint but undeniable, a sound threading through the floorboards. The soft, broken breath of something that should have been buried long ago. Because in the Miller home, the real victims weren't just the living. Every small town has that one person who notices what others choose to ignore. In Marion County, that was Lydia Harper, a widow who lived a quarter-mile down the ridge from the Millers. She was known for her keen eyes, sharp tongue, and a habit of watching the world from her porch long after the lamps went out. Folks said Lydia could tell a storm was coming by the way the trees bent. But what she saw one October night wasn't weather, it was revelation. That evening, the air hung thick with wood smoke and the hum of crickets. Lydia had been mending a torn dress when she noticed a flicker at the edge of the tree line, a lantern swinging too erratically to be carried by a man at ease. Through her spyglass, she saw Jonas Pike stumbling toward the Miller barn, his face ghostly pale, muttering something she couldn't quite hear. Behind him, the farmhouse windows glowed faintly, and on the porch, Eliza stood frozen, clutching the doorframe, her lips moving in frantic prayer. Now, I want you to imagine the silence of that moment. No dogs barking, no wind, just the lonely rasp of the barn door sliding open. The light disappeared inside. Then came a sound Lydia would never forget, a scream that started as human but ended like an animal's cry. It echoed off the hills, cut short so suddenly it made her drop the glass. She ran to her window, heart hammering, but the light from the barn had gone out completely. Only the moon remained, hanging cold and still over the Miller property. Lydia swore she saw a shadow, small, hunched, moving on all fours, slipping back through the door before it shut. By morning, Jonas Pike was gone. The Millers said he'd left before dawn to find work in Arkansas. But Lydia knew better because she'd seen the ground behind the barn freshly turned, the soil damp and dark like it had been crying. For weeks after that night, Lydia Harper couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard that scream, raw, sudden, torn from something that didn't sound fully human. She told herself it was just the wind, or a coyote, or maybe Jonas Pike drunk and hurting himself. But deep down, she knew better. The sound hadn't come from the woods. It had come from inside the Miller barn. The morning after, she'd walked the ridge to fetch water and forced herself to glance toward the Miller's property. Thomas was out front, splitting logs as if nothing had happened. His shirt sleeves were rolled, his movements steady, deliberate. But there was something off in his eyes, an emptiness, a refusal to see the world looking back at him. When he noticed her watching, he raised his hand in greeting, and that hollow smile flickered across his face again. Lydia waved back, her stomach twisting. She tried to tell people, of course. Down at the general store, she whispered to the clerk about the light, the scream, the fresh dirt behind the barn. But gossip travels fast and mutates faster. By the time it reached the preacher, it was a story about a drunken Jonas chasing ghosts. The Reverend visited Thomas, prayed with him, and told the congregation the HAINT had been laid to rest. That was the official word. Case closed. Still, Lydia couldn't let it go. Some nights she'd wake to the faintest sobbing on the wind, carried across the hollow, the same rhythm she'd heard before. Once, she followed the sound halfway down the ridge before she stopped because she realized something chilling. It wasn't coming from the barn anymore. It was coming toward her. Now, I want you to picture her there, barefoot in the dew, her lantern trembling in her hand, listening to the soft voice of a child whisper her name. And when she turned back toward the farmhouse, the window of the Miller home was dark, except the one in the barn. When a man vanishes in a small town, people talk. When that man is a drifter like Jonas Pike, people shrug. The first snow had just dusted the hollow when the sheriff finally rode out to the Miller property, more out of obligation than suspicion. Sheriff Earl Kinney was a practical man, heavy-set, with a fondness for coffee and a hatred of paperwork. To him, Jonas was another wanderer who'd skipped his wages and moved on. Still, he needed to file a report, if only to keep the preacher quiet. Thomas Miller greeted him with his usual iron calm. He invited the sheriff inside, offered him coffee, and spun a story smooth as creek stone. Said Jonas had been restless, talking about heading south for the rail camps. Said he'd given the man his pay early, out of Christian kindness. Even produced a folded note, supposedly, written by Jonas himself. Uneven handwriting, barely legible but enough for a man who didn't want trouble. Sheriff Kinney rode out to the barn afterward, more for show than belief. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint, sour smell of rot. He found nothing, no tracks, no tools out of place, no sign of struggle. Thomas stood beside him, lantern in hand, the flame trembling slightly, but his voice steady. "You see, Sheriff, the Lord has quieted the HAINT. Ain't been a sound in weeks. Now, I want you to imagine that scene. The sheriff stepping back into the pale daylight, satisfied enough to leave, while behind him, the boards of the barn shifted just slightly, like something breathing slow beneath them. The official record listed Jonas Pike as missing, presumed itinerant, no inquiry, no questions. And within days, the gossip turned elsewhere. But Lydia Harper didn't forget. She noticed how the Miller children never played outside anymore. She noticed how Eliza had stopped going to church. And she noticed, most of all, how the barn door, once latched tight, now stood cracked open, just wide enough for a small voice to slip through. By early spring, the Miller family looked changed. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was as if the color had been drained out of them, one sunrise at a time. Eliza moved through the house like she was made of smoke, her skin pale, her lips cracked from whispering prayers through too many sleepless nights. She kept a scarf around her throat even when the weather turned warm, and neighbors began to whisper that she'd taken ill. But illness didn't explain the way her eyes darted toward the barn every time the wind shifted, as if she expected it to speak back to her. The children weren't spared either. Clara, once bright and chatty, had gone near mute. She spent her days sitting on the porch steps, staring out toward the fields, humming tunelessly to herself. Sometimes she'd hold out her hands, palms open, as though expecting someone small to take them. Ben, her little brother, had started sleepwalking. More than once, Thomas found him standing barefoot by the barn door, fingers curled around the latch, tears on his cheeks. When asked what he was doing, the boy only said, "He keeps calling me." Now, let's be honest, people in town noticed. Lydia Harper certainly did. When she stopped by with bread one morning, she saw the children flinch at the creak of the door, their eyes wide, fixed on something behind her. The air inside the house felt heavy, thick with mildew, and something sour like milk left too long in the heat. And that's when she saw it. A small, muddy footprint by the hearth, no larger than a child's, but wrong somehow. The toes too long, the arch too flat, like it belonged to something that had forgotten how to walk upright. When she asked about it, Eliza only whispered, "Please, Mrs. Harper, don't ask about the barn." By midsummer of 1901, whispers about Thomas Miller's late-night experiments had started leaking from the farm to the town square. Folks had always known Thomas to be clever, with his hands fixing clocks, tinkering with tools, even building his own lightning rods long before anyone else in the Ozarks had them. But what Lydia Harper saw one night through her looking-glass was something far beyond tinkering. Thomas had begun dragging strange equipment into the barn, brass instruments, coiled wire, jars filled with what looked like river water that glowed faintly under the lantern light. Once, she swore she saw him carrying a jar that held something moving inside, something small and grey. You see, Thomas wasn't haunted by superstition. He believed in control. He'd spent months writing letters to a man in Springfield who claimed to study electrical reanimation, a crude, dangerous idea born from a misunderstanding of new scientific frontiers. Thomas became obsessed with the notion that the human spirit could be stimulated back into the body through electricity. That's what he'd been trying to do to his firstborn son, the baby that had died in its crib 3 years before the HAINT began to cry. He had built crude galvanic devices powered by lightning he trapped through copper lines that ran from the roof into the barn. Eliza had begged him to stop. She said it wasn't resurrection, it was desecration, but Thomas called it progress. He told her God had given man knowledge for a reason, and that, if he could bring back what was lost, it would prove the divine spark wasn't heaven's alone to command. Now picture the barn that night, thunder rolling, the air sharp with ozone, and a body small, preserved, almost perfect, laid out on a table, sparks crawling across its skin, and for one terrible second, something moved. That was the night the HAINT began to breathe. By the time the truth began to seep through the cracks of the Miller farm, it was too late. What Thomas Miller had started as science had twisted into something much older and far darker. It began with the lightning. Every time a storm rolled over the Ozarks, Thomas would vanish into the barn, hauling coils of copper, jars of salt water, and an old Bible that looked half-burned at the edges. The family knew better than to follow. Eliza locked herself in the house and prayed until her voice went hoarse. The children hid beneath their beds. Lydia Harper, sleepless and sick with dread, watched one storm night through the downpour. She saw the barn roof flash white, then red like blood catching the light, and she heard him chanting, not in Latin, not in scripture, but something older, syllables that bent the air itself. Between each strike of thunder came a low, rhythmic hum, the sound of the galvanic machine pulsing like a mechanical heart. Thomas had moved beyond mere revival. He believed the soul could be anchored, trapped between death and life, given form by faith and current. His ritual was part machine, part prayer, part blasphemy. The copper wires served as veins, the crucifix as a conduit, the corpse as the vessel. He called it the binding. On that night, when lightning struck the iron rod above the barn, witnesses from a mile away swore they saw the entire structure glow from within a fierce, unnatural blue. And then came the scream. It wasn't the cry of a man, nor the wail of a ghost. It was the sound of something born wrong, something forced back across a threshold never meant to be crossed. When the storm cleared, Thomas stumbled from the barn, soaked and trembling, his hair white as frost. Behind him, faintly, something moved in the shadows, a shape small enough to crawl, but heavy enough to leave prints in the mud. He had done it. He had called his son back, but what had answered him wasn't human. It began as a whisper in the walls, soft, rhythmic like a child humming an old lullaby through splintered wood. At first, Eliza thought it was her mind unraveling from grief, but when Clara started repeating the same tune in her sleep, word for word, the melody Thomas used to sing to their firstborn, dread bloomed in, her chest like frost on glass. At night, the sounds grew sharper, scraping along the barn floorboards, the creak of the loft ladder under invisible weight, the low, wet sound of breathing. "It's the wind," Thomas would say, "just the wind." But he stopped sleeping altogether. Each dawn, he'd returned from the barn with hands blackened by soot and ash, eyes hollowed by sleepless guilt. The man who once believed in reason now muttered prayers under his breath, clutching a pocket cross until his palm bled. Lydia Harper, the midwife turned accidental witness, swore she heard it too. Passing by one night, she froze at the fence when she heard a voice whisper her name. A child's voice. "Miss Harper," it said, soft as rain. "Help me. I'm cold." She ran before she could look back, but the sound followed her halfway down the road, faint, desperate, alive. Now, you have to understand something. In small Ozark towns, rumors travel faster than truth. The Millers became specters in their own community. Neighbors spoke of crying sounds echoing across the fields at dawn, of shadows moving against the lantern light when no one stood inside. And more than one traveler, passing by, claimed to hear a knock from within that locked barn 3 times, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was inside wanted the world to know it was still there. One evening, when thunder rolled over the hills again, Eliza finally broke. She ran to the barn, screaming her son's name, the name no one dared speak anymore. The reply came instantly. Not a voice, not words, just a single, dragging breath that ended with a sound she could never forget, a laugh. A child's laugh, coming from the dark. Now, before we go any further, I need to ask you something. Can you handle what comes next? Because everything up until now, the whispers, the storms, the screams, that was only the beginning. What's waiting beyond this point isn't just folklore or grief. It's something that defies both science and faith. The kind of truth that makes your skin crawl and your heartbeat feel too loud in the dark. If you've made it this far, you're one of us, the kind of soul who doesn't turn away when the story gets too heavy. So, before we descend deeper into the Miller Farm secrets, subscribe to Shadow Stories right now. Join this investigation into history's hidden horrors. Drop your location in the comments, let us know where you're listening from. Because the strange thing about stories like this, they have a way of finding those who believe. Now, take a breath, because what we're about to uncover next will make you question what being alive truly means. The night Lydia Harper returned to the Miller property, the moon was low and copper-red, the color of old blood. She wasn't there to spy. She came because the cries had changed. They weren't weeping anymore. They were calling. And each time the wind shifted, she swore she could hear her own name, woven in. She carried a lantern, its weak glow barely cutting through the mist, and stepped toward the barn. The air was thick, metallic, like lightning trapped in her throat. The door was bolted, chained, and yet the boards were warm beneath her palm, humming faintly, as if the wood itself was alive. That's when she saw it, the hole in the side wall, just big enough for a desperate woman's eye. Inside, the lantern's light flickered against something that should not have existed. A makeshift altar of copper wire, glass jars filled with what looked like fluid, and eyes. Human eyes. Each jar labeled with dates: June 1897, August 1898, April 1901. At the center lay a small figure, bound in fabric and wire, its chest rising and falling in shallow rhythmic gasps. Then came the whisper, soft, childlike. "Ma." Lydia stumbled back, dropping the lantern. Flames licked the dirt floor, illuminating a truth too grotesque to deny. Thomas Miller had not just revived his son, he had rebuilt him piece by piece, life by stolen life. Now, you have to picture this, a barn glowing with firelight, the wind howling through broken boards, and from within that blaze, something crawling toward the door, still breathing, still calling for its mother. Lydia ran, barefoot, breath ragged, dress torn by thorns as she tore across the fields. Behind her, the barn crackled and screamed, wood splitting, metal shrieking, and beneath it all, that awful, high-pitched laughter. The fire had awakened it. Now I want you to picture this, the storm clouds rolling in again, lightning flashing across the valley, and in every flash, Lydia catching glimpses of something following her through the dark low to the ground, wrong in its movements. Crawling, dragging, breathing. She stumbled into the Miller house, slamming the door shut. Eliza was inside, trembling, clutching a Bible. "You saw him, didn't you?" she whispered. "My boy." He came back. But before Lydia could answer, the door behind them shuddered. A slow, rhythmic thump, then another. The latch began to rattle. Thomas appeared on the stairs, wild-eyed, face half-lit by the flames outside. "Don't open it," he hissed. "He doesn't know what he is anymore." But Eliza moved anyway, drawn by a sound no mother could resist. A tiny voice from beyond the door. "Mama, it's cold." The door burst inward. The fire's glow framed a figure small enough to be a child, but stitched and scorched beyond humanity. Veins of copper glinting under the skin, eyes reflecting nothing but pain. Lydia screamed. Thomas lunged, and as thunder cracked overhead, he dragged both the creature and himself into the burning fields beyond. The last thing Lydia saw before fainting was the two shapes, father and son, vanishing into the blaze as if swallowed by it. And when the rain came, the fire went out. But the cries did not. They echoed from the barn's ashes. When Lydia Harper finally reached the nearest town, soaked, barefoot, half-delirious dawn was just breaking over the Ozark ridge. The sheriff's men found her collapsed outside the old trading post, her hands blistered, her voice gone raw from screaming. All she could whisper was one word: "Barn." At first, they thought she'd gone mad. The Millers were respected, church-going, charitable, the kind of family whose name appeared on donation plaques, not police ledgers. But when the deputies rode out to the farm, all they found was smoke, ash, and a silence that felt alive. The barn stood blackened but intact, as if the fire had chosen its own mercy. They brought Lydia back, questioned her under lantern light. "You're saying Thomas Miller resurrected his son?" the sheriff asked, smirking behind his mustache. "That's witch talk." She told them about the copper, the jars, the voice that called for its mother, but the word she spoke sounded crazier than the last. By nightfall, the story had flipped. The official word was hysteria. A lightning strike caused the blaze. The family, overcome by grief, perished in the fire. Lydia was branded, fevered, kept under watch by the local doctor. Her screams of "he's still out there" echoed down the ward halls until they sedated her. Now, let's be honest, that's how history buries the unexplainable. It wraps it in reason, ties it up in bureaucracy, and locks it away behind a paper label: tragic accident. But 3 nights later, the sheriff resigned without explanation. He told his deputy only one thing: "Don't ever go near that farm again." The boy's still crying, and the deputy swore he heard it too. From the ashes, it took nearly 2 weeks for the county to act. The newspapers had begun printing wild claims: the resurrection in the Ozarks, the Devil's Barn. Public pressure finally forced the sheriff's office to organize what they called an official investigation. But make no mistake, it wasn't courage that sent those men to the Miller property. It was fear, disguised as duty. The raid began just after dawn. 5 deputies, the town doctor, and a reverend rode out under a cold mist. The barn still stood charred, hollow-eyed, a black skeleton against the pale sky. When they forced the doors open, the air inside was thick with rot and ozone, the smell of burnt copper and old blood. Now, I want you to picture this: lantern light sweeping across the dirt floor, revealing scorched symbols carved into the beams, spirals, crosses turned backward, words in no known language. In the corner stood a wooden table fused to the earth by melted wire. On it, they found what the report would later call organic remnants. But witnesses, those few who spoke before recanting, said it wasn't remnants at all. It was a shape, small, almost human. The doctor swore he saw its chest move. The reverend began to pray so violently his voice broke. Then came a sound, low, rattling, coming from beneath the floorboards. When one deputy pried them open, a rush of heat hit his face, followed by a whisper, a single word: "Mama." They sealed the barn that very night. No one spoke of what they'd seen. The official report was filed, then locked away. But by winter's end, every man on that raid was dead. 3 shot. Themselves. 2 simply vanished. For months, the town believed Thomas Miller was a madman, a grieving father who lost his mind and dragged his family into ruin. But that was the lie. The truth, as Lydia Harper would later uncover in half-burnt letters and torn ledgers, was far more deliberate and far more horrifying. Thomas hadn't acted alone. Hidden within the correspondence found among the ashes were names respectable men from the nearby county seat. Dr. Emmett Caldwell, a physician with ties to the local asylum, and Reverend Josiah Pike, the same man who had led the official raid. They called themselves the Lazarus Circle. Their aim? To bridge the gap between faith and science, to prove the soul could be preserved, transferred, even shared. Now, I want you to really picture this. These weren't outcasts in cloaks performing rituals by moonlight. These were church elders, town benefactors, pillars of early 20th century morality. Men who preached salvation on Sunday, then met in secret to test the boundaries of resurrection on Monday. Thomas was their prototype. The grieving farmer desperate enough to follow their instructions, to turn his dead son into a vessel. The others supplied materials, money, and specimens. Unclaimed bodies from the asylum's cellar. Or worse, still breathing subjects deemed beyond saving. When the experiment succeeded, when the thing in the barn opened its eyes, the circle panicked. They cut ties, burned evidence, and sent word to authorities framing Thomas as a lunatic. But secrets rot slower than bodies, and Lydia's discovery of those letters meant only one thing. The men who led the raid that silenced the Millers were the same men who created the horror in that barn. Now, you tell me who's the real monster here? The Lazarus Circle, it turned out, wasn't born in the Ozarks, it migrated there. Lydia's discovery of the ledgers exposed a web far beyond that quiet Missouri Valley. Letters dated back to 1884, some marked with seals from London, Vienna, and even St. Petersburg. Their language was coded, their tone clinical, and yet beneath every phrase pulsed an obsession, the continuity of the soul through electrical means. Now, let's be honest, this wasn't faith, it was commerce. The Circle had turned resurrection into an exportable science. They exchanged data with European, spiritual laboratories, where men in white coats claimed to photograph souls leaving the body. One London investor even wired payment to T. Miller, Ozarks, USA, describing it as compensation for the 7th experiment. The implication? The Millers weren't the first. And here's where the story takes a turn most historians quietly avoid. The U.S. Army's Medical Corps had apparently received reports of electro-spiritual transference as early as 1902, classified as theoretical resurrection applications. Which means, somewhere deep in government archives, this horror wasn't dismissed as witchcraft. It was studied. Lydia traced these threads as far as she could through forged documents, missing telegrams, and one European name that kept resurfacing: Dr. Hans Kappel, a Viennese surgeon who disappeared in 1899 after his experiments on suspended animation were condemned by the church. His final letter, found among Miller's possessions, read simply, "The soul resists, but the current remembers." So what began as a family tragedy in the Ozarks wasn't an isolated nightmare. It was the American chapter of a much larger design, one that saw human lives not as sacred, but as conductors. And if you think that ended in 1901, you might be wrong. You'd think a story like this, a family destroyed, a ritual of resurrection, an international cabal of doctors and clergymen, would have shattered the public conscience. But it didn't. It was erased. And not by accident. Within weeks of the investigation, the Miller farm was quietly purchased by a land management trust linked to the very men named in Lydia's notes. The ruins were bulldozed, the ashes buried under a new foundation, and the road leading there renamed on county maps. The Spring Hollow farm you'll find today. It's a different property entirely, at least. That's what the official records say. The local paper that printed Lydia's testimony suddenly folded. Its editor was offered a relocation opportunity in Street Louis. Even church sermons shifted overnight, ministers warning of the dangers of false prophets and female hysteria. Lydia herself was labeled unstable, confined to an asylum, her letters intercepted before she could contact the state press. Now, I want you to think about that, how entire communities can agree, without ever speaking aloud, to bury something too terrible to confront. Neighbors, officials, even clergy, all bound by the same unspoken pact, pretend it never happened, because silence in small towns isn't just safety, it's survival. And for decades, that silence held. No one spoke of the Millers, no one mentioned the barn, the few who did, their homes mysteriously burned, their names erased from census lists. But you can only bury the truth so deep before the ground starts to whisper. And in the Ozarks, even today, there are nights when locals swear they still hear it, a child's voice, soft and distant, asking one simple question: "Why did you leave me?" When the silence finally settled over the Ozarks, it was as if the land itself had conspired to forget. But the men who had orchestrated the horror, the members of the Lazarus Circle, couldn't escape what they'd awakened. Their ends came quietly, almost poetically, as if the thing they had created had marked them each for retribution. Dr. Emmett Caldwell, the asylum physician, was found in his office 6 months later, no sign of forced entry, just his body slumped over a desk, a copper wire clenched so tightly in his hand it had cut into bone. His final journal entry read, "He's learning to speak through the current." Reverend Josiah Pike, who'd preached salvation while hiding damnation, vanished during a revival tour through Kansas. Witnesses claimed the tent lights flickered during his final sermon, a blinding flash. Then darkness. When the lanterns were relit, the pulpit was empty. His Bible was found smoldering, the words on the last page melted into unreadable black. And Lydia Harper, the woman who refused to be silent, survived the longest. After years confined to a sanatorium, she was released into obscurity. Locals said she spent her final days sitting by a window, writing letters to someone no one ever saw. When she died in 1921, the nurse cleaning her room found one unfinished note. It read, "He visits me when it storms. He's taller now." As for the Miller farm, it changed hands dozens of times. Every owner swore it was cursed animals born wrong. Lights in the fields, voices beneath the floor. Some say it was just guilt haunting them. Others aren't so sure, because evil doesn't die, it waits. Time has a way of sanding down horror into legend, turning blood into folklore and tragedy into bedtime stories whispered by the fire. That's exactly what happened in the Ozarks. The HAINT in the barn became a ghost tale told to keep children from wandering too far after dark. The truth, the human truth, rotted beneath layers of superstition and silence. But the legacy of the Millers, the story isn't just about a haunted farm. It's about the lengths people will go to outrun grief and the monsters they create along the way. Thomas Miller wasn't born a villain. He was a father who couldn't accept death's final word. The men of the Lazarus Circle weren't demons, at least not at first. They were scholars, priests, visionaries who let ambition eclipse empathy. Each of them believed they were defying nature, when in reality, they were simply feeding the oldest hunger of all, the refusal to let go. Now, I want you to picture this. Every storm that rolls through the Ozarks, lightning clawing across the sky, the wind carrying faint echoes through hollowed trees. Locals still swear that if you stand near where the Miller barn once stood, you can hear a single word in the thunder: Mama. Maybe it's just wind. Maybe it's guilt passed down through generations. Or maybe it's proof that when we tamper with the boundary between life and death, we leave something behind, something that doesn't forgive and never forgets. Because some stories don't fade with time. They wait in the dark, patient and eternal, for someone curious enough or foolish enough to listen again. So, what do you think? Could a story like this, a grieving father, a secret order, a child pulled back from death, really have happened? Or has the truth simply been buried beneath a century of whispers and rewritten history? Because, if you look closely enough at the old records, at the unmarked graves, at the families who suddenly stopped appearing in census logs, you might start to wonder whether the Miller farm was just one experiment among many. Now here's the chilling part. Similar reports of electrical resurrection attempts surfaced in Tennessee in 1904 and, again in Maine, in 1910. Same language, same symbols, different names. So, was this a coincidence, or the continuation of something much larger? I want you to really think about that. Could such horrors remain hidden for so long? And more importantly, do you believe something like this could still happen today? Tell me your thoughts. Below your theories, your beliefs, your fears. Share this story with someone brave enough to listen to the dark. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Shadow Stories, where we peel back the layers of history's forgotten nightmares, one chilling secret at a time. Because the next tale we're uncovering might just change how you see the past and what still lingers beneath it. See you in the next story, where another dark secret from America's forgotten century waits to be unearthed.